12 rounds. 11 kills, 4 days. That's the combat record of a rifle that changed World War II tactics. A raffle prize, a Winchester Model 70 with a mail-order scope. The kind of rifle a man might use to hunt deer in Illinois. A U.S. Army captain called it a toy, ordered it, left in the tent. But on Guadalcanal in January 1943, while Japanese snipers picked off Americans from banyan trees 80 feet up, 2nd Lieutenant John George carried it anyway. What happened next would change how the United States military thought about long-range combat forever. The wooden crate arrived 6 weeks late. George had won the rifle for $1, a raffle ticket at a National Guard shooting competition back in Illinois. First prize. He'd spent 2 years of guard pay adding the scope and mount, dollar by dollar. Then the 132nd Infantry shipped out. The rifle didn't. George spent the voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their Garands while his Winchester sat in a warehouse stateside. He requested it to be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks. That's how long it took. When the supply sergeant finally handed him the crate marked fragile, George opened it like a man reuniting with an old friend. Winchester Model 70. Bolt action, 5 rounds, Lyman Alaskan scope, 9 pounds, 12 ounces. Captain Morris saw it that afternoon.
Leave the sporting rifle in your tent, Lieutenant. Carry a real weapon.
George nodded and carried it anyway. The 132nd had relieved the Marines in late December. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field. They had held it, but they had not taken Mount Austin. The Japanese called it the Gifu. 500 men, 47 bunkers, a fortress carved into the jungle. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. 16 days of fighting, 34 killed, 279 wounded. Bunker assaults, hand grenades, bayonets. George fired his Winchester exactly 0 times. The jungle was too dense, the fighting too close, no targets beyond 50 yards, no use for a scoped rifle when the enemy was in the next foxhole. By January 2nd, the Gifu fell. The men who survived thought the worst was over. They were wrong. Corporal Davis was filling his canteen at a creek when the bullet hit him. No warning, no sound before the shot, just a crack from somewhere in the trees. Davis was dead before he hit the water. The patrol searched for an hour, found nothing. The shooter was gone. The next day, 2 men from L Company died on a routine patrol. Same pattern. Single shots, no muzzle flash. The jungle swallowed the killer like he had never existed. The day after that, 3 more. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree that the patrol had walked past twice. 14 Americans dead in 72 hours. The battalion commander summoned George that night. Colonel Grubb was not a man who wasted words. He stood over a map table in the command tent, sweat staining his collar, mosquitoes circling the single lamp. He looked at George.
I hear you have a rifle.
Yes, sir.
I hear your captain thinks it's a toy.
George said nothing. Grubb leaned forward.
I don't care if it's a slingshot, Lieutenant. I need someone who can shoot. Can that mail-order rifle of yours actually hit anything?
George told him. Illinois State Championship, 1,000 yards, youngest winner in history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 with the scope. Grubb studied him for a long moment.
You have until morning to prove it.
Yes, sir.
And George,
Sir.
don't miss.
George spent the night preparing. He cleaned the rifle again, barrel, action, trigger assembly, checked the scope mounts, loaded 5 rounds of match-grade 30-06 he had brought from Tennessee. The Japanese snipers carried Arisaka Type 99s, same effective range as the Winchester. They had been trained for jungle warfare. They knew how to climb, how to hide, how to wait. George knew how to wait too. At 0400, he gave up on sleep. He sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. $1, one raffle ticket, 14 Americans are already dead. By sunrise, he would find out what that dollar was worth. George moved into position before dawn. A ruined Japanese bunker overlooking the coconut groves. Good sight lines, solid cover. The snipers operated from the banyans, some 90 feet tall, trunks 8 feet thick. A man could climb one before first light and sit there all day without being seen. George settled in. No spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, canteen, and 60 rounds. He began to glass the trees. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification. Not much, but enough to see movement the naked eye would miss. Nothing. He filtered out the noise. Birds, insects, the distant thump of artillery, focused only on movement. A branch that shifted without wind, a shadow that didn't belong. Then he saw it. A branch moved, no wind, 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. A man, dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met, facing east, watching the trail where American supply parties had been moving. The same trail where 3 men had died yesterday. George adjusted his scope. 2 clicks right for wind. Controlled his breathing, finger on the trigger. The sniper in the tree had no idea he was already dead, but George did. He knew something else too, something that made his finger hesitate on the trigger for just a fraction of a second. Japanese snipers never worked alone. The Winchester kicked into George's shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. His body tumbled through the branches, 90 feet of free fall, and hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. The empty cartridge was ejected. He chambered another round. 1 shot, 1 kill. He kept his scope on the tree, waited for movement, nothing. But the sniper's partner would be close. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere nearby, watching, waiting. George scanned the surrounding trees. The scope's 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. Shadows everywhere. At 0943, he found him. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. Lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21, they did. A bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, different direction from the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have relocated after taking the shot. Basic sniper doctrine: shoot and move. But in a jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. At 11:38, George found him. The 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice.
How many? 5 confirmed.
Morris nodded slowly.
Be back in position at dawn.
The second day began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain had stopped at 08:15. By 08:45, enough visibility had returned for work. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 09:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The sound of rain masked movement. The sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday. Also smart. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for the distance and fired. The sniper fell. The 6th kill brought a response George had not anticipated. At 09:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third salvo would hit the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater as the third salvo hit. The bunker he had occupied moments before disappeared in explosions and flying debris. They were hunting him now. George relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The position provided cover and a clear view of the groves. He settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. They were hunting him back. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. At 14:23, George killed his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he killed his 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up. Good concealment, but the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers.
8 confirmed kills over 2 days.
Morris stared at him.
8 in 2 days.
Yes, sir.
Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers are operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 now dead, 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived the longest, the ones who had watched their comrades die and learned from every kill. Somewhere in those trees, they were already planning. George didn't know it yet, but tomorrow he would walk into a trap. The rain had stopped. George was in a new position, a cluster of rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. He spotted sniper number 9 at 08:17. Palm tree, 190 yards out. Low, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began to squeeze the trigger, then stopped. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was a decoy, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot. Took 11 minutes. At 08:28, he found him, a banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up, perfect concealment. Clear line of sight to George's previous positions. 2 snipers working together, bait and trap. George made his decision. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree, fired. The decoy jerked and fell. George swung his rifle toward the banyan. The real sniper was turning toward the sound. Movement. George fired before the man could fully turn. The 10th sniper fell. Both down. 10 seconds. But George had revealed his position. At 08:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been 6 seconds earlier. He was already in a drainage ditch 40 yards away. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th would be the best. At 09:47, George realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, moving through the undergrowth, crawling towards George's last known position. George watched from a water-filled crater submerged up to his chest. The Japanese soldier reached the rocks at 10:03. He took up a position facing east towards the drainage ditch. His back was exposed. 38 yards, an easy shot, but something was wrong. George expanded his awareness. At 10:06, he found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest, behind a fallen tree. Rifle aimed towards the ditch. 2 men, not 1. George could not shoot both before they reacted. The bolt action required him to cycle it between shots. That gave them time to locate him and return fire. He sank deeper into the water. Only his eyes were above the surface. Rifle pointed skyward to keep the barrel dry, and waited. At 10:13, the sniper in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He signaled to his partner. Both men began moving parallel to each other, 70 yards apart, executing a sweep. They moved past George's crater, their backs exposed. George rose from the water, slowly, silently, water dripping from the barrel. He aimed at the closer soldier, 42 yards, fired. The soldier dropped. George cycled the action, swung towards the second man. The soldier was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 snipers, 4 days, 12 rounds fired, 11 hits. The Point Cruz groves were clear. Then George heard the voices, Japanese, multiple men, moving toward the fallen soldiers. Not snipers, infantry, a patrol or recovery team. George dropped back into the crater. The voices grew closer. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim, looking directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. He cycled the action while submerged, rose up. 2 more soldiers at the crater rim. George fired, cycled, fired again. Both dropped. 3 rounds left. More soldiers coming. George climbed out on the north side and ran. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle behind him. Bullets struck trees, kicked up dirt. He ran for 90 seconds before diving into a dry shell crater. The voices faded. They had not pursued. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself, walked to battalion headquarters. Morris wanted the full count.
11 Japanese snipers, 4 days, 12 rounds against snipers, 11 hits, then a firefight with infantry, 3 more kills.
Morris was silent for a long moment.
Clean your rifle, rest. The battalion is moving east. Point Cruz is no longer a priority.
George returned to his tent, field stripped the Winchester, cleaned every component. $1, 1 raffle ticket, 14 enemy soldiers are dead. The mail order sweetheart had done its job, but someone had been watching, someone who wanted to know if what George had done could be repeated, someone who would change everything. Colonel Ferry had one question.
Can you train other men to do what you did?
George stood in the regimental command tent, still wearing the same mud-caked uniform from Point Cruz. Ferry was the regimental commander. He had read Morris's report. He had seen the numbers.
I can try, sir, but it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who can already shoot.
Ferry nodded. He leaned forward.
Create a sniper section, train them, develop tactics, and clear any remaining Japanese from our operational areas.
George accepted, but he had one condition.
I keep my Winchester.
Ferry approved the request. Training began the same day. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. They were expert marksmen on paper, qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards. None of them had killed a man from concealment. George started with fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind, finding positions, using terrain. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the Unertel scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. He taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Range training lasted 3 days. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. The results exceeded expectations. Over the next 12 days, George's sniper section killed 74 Japanese soldiers. Confirmed kills only, bodies observed through scopes. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star, but the war was not finished with him. On February 7th, near the Bonegi River, a Japanese rifleman shot George through the left shoulder. The bullet passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. He was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. 2 days later, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. George's war continued. After recovering, he volunteered for a classified mission in Burma, Merrill's Marauders, 700 miles through impossible terrain. He carried his Winchester the entire way, modified with a lighter scope and synthetic stock. He used it 7 times in 3 months. 7 shots, 7 kills. But Burma was different. Close-range ambushes, dense vegetation, no long-range precision work. The age of the bolt-action rifle was ending. George understood. Semi-automatic weapons were the future. Mass production, standardization. The era of the individual marksman with a personal rifle was fading. But he kept the Winchester anyway. It had earned its place. John George was discharged in January 1947. Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart. He went to Princeton, then Oxford, then the State Department. Lived quietly. But in 1947, he wrote it all down. Shots fired in anger. No embellishment, no hero worship, just the weapons, the tactics, and the men who used them. The book is still in print today. George died on January 3rd, 2009, 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a glass case with a small placard. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle, but it is not.